So I think I've mentioned before, I fly every week, every single week. It's great because I get to go see some great clients, meet some great people. It's a little tough on the body. But one of the things in reflecting on this interview is that I personally, and I think we all do, take for granted how safe it really is to fly nowadays. 2016 was the second safest year on record. There was 19 fatal accidents, 325 deaths. Now, listen, for the folks that were impacted by that, that is like the biggest deal in the world. I get that. But the fact that it's down to 325 deaths worldwide is just amazing. And that's down from 560 in 2015. And let me put this into context. And I can't even fathom this number, but there were 3.5 billion air passengers flown in 2016. So if you do the math, that's just one fatality for every 10,769,230 travelers. It's unbelievable. Much safer than driving, taking the bus, the train, what have you. So what does this mean for you? It means that when you jump on a plane, even though it may be scary for you, it is very safe. It also means, in the background, airlines take your safety unbelievably seriously. And in today's episode, we get this awesome opportunity to understand what airlines do. We are joined by Paul Morrell, who for the last several years has led safety at both American Airlines and US Air. We have so much to learn from Paul. I'm actually pretty excited because I think there's a lot of learnings that risk management and crisis management professionals can take in preparing for that novel crisis or preparing and responding to that big risk event.
The other perspective is just having the foresight to be looking at the things, not living day to day of what we're doing today, but what we're looking at tomorrow. And then when we're planning for tomorrow, what are the risks that we might encounter? And then staying on top of that, because as you well know, everything's changing.
Welcome to Resilient, where we hear stories from leaders on risk, disruption, and crisis. And we get those stories by jumping on a plane, and it's no pun today because we're going to be talking about aviation, and meeting our guests on their home turf. My name is Mike Kearney, a partner in Deloitte Strategic Risk Practice. And I have, like I say every time, this unbelievably good fortune of sitting down with great leaders who really define what it is to be resilient. I moonlight, I get to talk to these people and I get to share their stories with you. And I will tell you, my journey over the last year, I have learned so much, and I've been able to integrate it into the way that I think about my life and also how I serve my clients. And I've been blown away by the constant engagement that I'm getting online. So many of you have reached out to me, telling me that you've enjoyed the conversations. And in fact, for the last couple weeks, I guess, I've been getting so much feedback on my interview with Mallory Wegman and how her story personally touched you, how you enjoyed the conversation, and how you have taken some of the things that she shared totally outside of the business world, but applied it to your life, applied it to the way that you do your work. And I'll tell you, I'm actually pretty excited about this because, as I mentioned during the Mallory podcast, it has always been my dream to interview people outside of the business world to understand their story of resilience and then apply it back to the things that we do on a day-to-day basis. So I'm fired up to find a lot more people that fit that description. So let's talk about today. I am sitting in the beautiful Biltmore Hotel in Phoenix, and it is a perfect, and when I say perfect, it is a perfect February morning. And I actually was walking over to the interview and I told my wife, I now actually get why people live in Arizona. It is beautiful. I'm really, really looking forward to talking to Paul. He's going to have, I think, some great insights, some great stories, and some life lessons that he could share with us. So enough of me prattling on. Let's get to my conversation with Paul. I don't think you know this, but I have always been fascinated with flying. And I think one of my earliest childhood memories was my dad was I've said many times on this podcast, he was a San Francisco cop, but he flew a little Piper Comanche. And he was getting certified on a twin engine. And every Tuesday, I was in kindergarten, so I didn't have class in the morning. It was afternoon. I would go out with him and fly with him all morning. And then when I was 16, I started flying lessons.
Oh, wow.
But here's the lesson to all the kids out there. I immediately stopped taking flying lessons the day I totaled my dad's car. Oh. And so my dad said to me, he goes, Mike, if you're not mature enough to drive a car, you're probably not mature enough to fly. And so I always had these aspirations that I was going to be a pilot someday. And it was that dumb decision that I made when I was 16 that took my whole life in a different direction. But that's my flying story. But always thought I was going to be a pilot, either in the Navy or the Air Force. It was always my dream when I was a little kid. So there you go. Hey, Paul, I want to start off with, one of the things that we talked about when we did the pre-call is I know that you are very linked to the Sully Sullenberger Miracle on the Hudson. And I'd love to just start there because I at your request, I watched the movie and it was fascinating. I think I also mentioned that Sully used to live in my hometown, so I got to see him around. But the question I have from you, and I want to dive into this, what was, in your opinion, for all those folks that are not in aviation, what was miraculous about that day?
That's interesting that you mentioned that, Mike. And people call it the Miracle on the Hudson, and I don't call it that. What I call it is a testament to all of the work that people have done over the years to ensure that we can take an airplane that has both engines that are hit by Canada geese. Both of those engines, not one of them failed to the extent that it destroyed the airplane.
Yep.
We have two pilots that were well trained that were able to fly that airplane. We had a design of the airplane by Airbus that allowed it to land in the water. We had a flight control system that allowed Sully to be able to control that airplane as it was approaching the water and not stall it. We had flight attendants that were trained, air traffic controllers that were trained, ferry operators that were trained. They all did all the things that we've been training to do, that we've designed that airplane to do, and 155 people survived. So to me, it's not a miracle, it's a testament to the work of many, many, many people over the years of a success story.
It's almost like, what's that quote where it says, what is it? Preparation meets, what is it?
Chance favored the prepared mind.
Yeah, chance favors the prepared mind. That's yeah. Let me ask you a question. So there was one thing in the movie, and I know that, like all movies, probably half of it's fictional. But and this was not really brought up that much in the movie, but he deactivated the auxiliary power unit.
Well, he didn't deactivate it.
He activated it. Excuse me. Yes. Did that make a big difference? Was that critical?
That was absolutely critical.
Then why is that?
I'll tell you. What happens is on the airplane you have this fly-by-wire system.
Yep.
And the fly-by-wire system needs electrical power. It needs the main power of the airplane to do it. But when both those engines wind down, you've lost the main power supply. So what it does is, if that happens, it reverts to what we call manual. And when you're in manual, you no longer have these protections that keep you from stalling the airplane if you pull full back.
Yep.
So the airplane could stall. When he started that APU, it has also a generator in it, and it ensured that flight control system had full electrical power. So he had all those protections. And when he got close to the water, he took that stick and he went full aft on that stick to get all the performance he could get from that airplane. And that fly-by-wire system and those protections kept it from stalling and gave him everything he needed in order to land that airplane.
And so that was part of his training to know immediately, if I blow two engines, I got to pull that, or no? Because in the movie, they said it was like number 15 on the checklist or something like that.
That's exactly right. And so that's one of the things that you see, one of the things we talk about is being prepared or thinking ahead of time for things. That's something that Sully did that most people probably would not have done. He had thought about that ahead of time. And instinctively, he said, let's start that APU. And that saved, I believe, everybody's life.
What does that say? So is there any learnings? Because there is a check. I'm guessing that checklist actually exists if you blow both engines.
Yeah, well, that checklist exists, but that checklist is predicated on the fact that you're at altitude. So you have
the
time.
fact that were they at 2,800 feet or something like that when it happened?
2,800 feet, not 28,000 feet.
Right.
So really, as a result of that accident, that checklist has been redesigned for a low altitude a response type of thing, and then a high altitude response.
So what does that say? Because we work with a lot of clients in crisis, and there's checklists, if you will. But what's interesting is he had the foresight to go around that checklist. Is there any learnings maybe for leaders around knowing what you're supposed to do, because there is a checklist of things, versus relying kind of on, I don't know how many years he was flying, but 30, 35 years, relying on your intuition. Is there any insight that you can bring to that around what you're supposed to do, but what you intuitively know you should do?
Well, I think checklists, in most cases, you want to follow a checklist the way it's been written, but in many cases, a checklist is only a guide, and it's going to get you started on where you need to go. And so sometimes, like you're talking about, you may need to deviate from that, and that's where experience plays into it, and that's where the circumstances that you're in play into it.
Absolutely. The NTSA was not profiled very favorably in the movie. I think that probably was not accurate. Can maybe you share the bit on that? Because it'd be nice to set the record straight about kind of the process that you go through and maybe clear up some of the misunderstanding if people have seen that movie.
Sure. The NTSB really is an organization that is apolitical, and they're all appointed, and they have a term. And the NTSB's whole purpose is to enhance aviation safety. And so when there is an accident, their job is to try to determine what was the cause, probable cause of the accident, and then what recommendations they can make in order to preclude another accident from happening. So in the case in the movie, they portrayed the NTSB as kind of the bad guys with a black hat, and that's not the case whatsoever. The way it works in reality is when there's an accident, they have a go team that goes, and the airline has a go team, and all the different people that are involved, they all go to the accident site.
And you were on that go team, right?
I was on that go team. I was the party coordinator for U.S. Airways. And what we do is we set up different subgroups, working groups with the NTSB that are going to look into everything from the engines to the flight control systems to the pilot factors, flight attendant factors, survival factors, all types of things we set up. And we have representatives from not only the industry being the airlines, also the manufacturers, but also labor is on it and the FAA is on it. And all these people work together as a team in order to try to do the investigation and try to determine what caused the accident. So it was a very, I would say, everybody working together. It was not adversarial in any way, shape, or form as it was portrayed in the movie.
What would so if we've seen the movie, what are some things that you think were portrayed correctly? Like, what were some of the things that you think they did a really nice job on?
They did an excellent job as far as the accident itself, as far as what Jeff Skiles and Sully Sullenberger did, what the flight attendants did, what happened to the airplane hitting the water, the survival of the ferry boat operators. All of the technical things relative to that were right on the money. They were really, really well done. It was the interface with the NTSB, which was very poorly portrayed.
Kind of at the end of the movie. You know, one of the, and once again, I don't know if this is true or not, and I don't even know if it really matters, but one of the things I loved about the end of the movie is Sully gave credit to everybody. I think somebody came up and said, it was all you. Thank you very much. And I think he recognized the flight attendants, his co-pilot, everybody that was involved. And I think one of the things I love is you always see great leaders. When times are good, they deflect praise. And when times are bad, they take 100% responsibility. And I love the fact that he basically gave praise to everyone. I'd love to get your perspective. Was it truly a team effort? Was all of the other folks that were involved in it as critical as he made it sound?
Oh, absolutely. Without every person in there that he had acknowledged, it wouldn't have succeeded as it did. It wasn't a one-man team. And one of the things they didn't put in there I thought was pretty interesting. Right before they hit the water, and you can see it in the transcript, Jeff Skiles says to Sully, "Got any other ideas?" And of course the answer was no.
Nope, there we go.
There we go.
Is there anything that you think a corporate leader can take away in terms of the way that Sully managed that crisis? Like, what were maybe some of the attributes or things that he did in a time of living and dying, 155 people he was responsible for? Is there anything that our leaders could take away?
Well, I think the real key is the team. It's having established a team, working together as a team, relying on each other, and that's where you're going to succeed.
Great. So, Paul, let's talk about you. I think, and let me make sure I got this right. I think since 2005, you've been responsible for safety, first at U.S. Air and then American Airlines. Maybe can you give a bit of background on the role that you had at American Airlines and what you've been doing over the last, say, 10 or 15 years?
Sure. I was in charge, and I just recently retired.
I know, and just got back from Costa Rica.
Got back from Costa Rica. I'm 10 days into retirement. I still don't know what it's like, but I'm finding out. But
it's hanging out with me in the Biltmore in Phoenix.
I
guess,
know.
Sorry about that.
And the weather's beautiful out there.
It is.
In February. So basically, my responsibilities were safety, and the safety with respect to everything from flight safety, in-flight safety, on the ramp, throughout the whole airline. So it's all purpose throughout the whole airline. I had security, so security from every aspect. That's also with the TSA, the FBI, and also internal to the whole company. Had environmental and risk management and regulatory compliance. And regulatory compliance ties in again with the FAA oversight. So all those areas. The thing that we worked on throughout that whole 11 years that I was in there is basically, I would call it, they call it safety management system, but I don't call it that. I call it a risk management system. And that's basically identifying hazards, identifying the risks associated with those hazards, mitigating those risks, and measuring how effective you are at it. So it's really, what I tried to do is go from a reactive type of culture to a proactive type.
Proactive.
Yes, exactly.
So how did you get into aviation? Maybe go back
Oh, that's
maybe a few years.
a few years, yeah.
Yeah.
A few years, like 48.
Okay. Well, I wasn't going to say anything, but okay.
That's okay. No, what happened was it was the Vietnam War was going on. It was time to go to college, so the Navy was very nice, and they said, we'll pay your way through college, but you're going to have to give us 4 years.
And where'd you go to college?
Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago, and I trained to be a civil engineer.
Okay.
And what I learned from that is I didn't want to do that for the rest of my life. I think a lot of people have gone through college and come up to that conclusion, but it gave me a very good foundation on logic and engineering and things like that.
And so then you went into
Well, I had to
into
go in the Navy,
Yep.
and then when I went into the Navy, it was kind of like, okay, what do you want to do? Do you want to be a CV, which was civil engineering, or
Right.
do you want to do something that sounds exciting, and that's fly airplanes?
And what was the plane you flew?
I flew the F-4.
Oh, I love that plane. Phantom, yep.
Yep, and then I was in the introduction of the F-14 into the Navy. So I did that for 8 years, and I became an instructor on the F-14, and then I got out, and then I went with the airlines.
Wait, you're skipping something I think is interesting. If I have it right, were you part of Top Gun for a little while?
I wasn't part of I was involved with Top Gun, yeah. I was involved with Top Gun.
So were you an instructor or?
No, I was
you
an
got one-
instructor on the F-14. I was an instructor in what we call tactics.
Okay.
So that's where you're air-to-air combat type of thing. So
Okay.
doing the same type of thing.
Did you prefer the F-14 or F-4? What was the?
That's a good. I like them both for
You
different
like them
reasons.
both.
Yeah.
So just since I like flying, what about the F4 versus the F14 and
The
vice versa?
F-4 is a basic airplane where you don't have all these computers doing all this stuff, so you're down to the basics. It's a real airplane. The F-14 has all types of computers doing all types of different things, and so now you're in a completely different ball game. So
It's almost like flying a video game versus.
I wouldn't go that far.
Yeah,
I wouldn't go that far.
I love. I was just on the. Oh my gosh, what is it? The USS Hornet. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
It's an aircraft. I spent
That's
the night.
an old one.
I spent the night on it a couple of
Did
weeks
you?
ago, and they had an F4 on it. So I was showing my 8-year-old. Yeah, it was part of Boy Scouts, but yeah, incredible. I learned that it has the most kills out of any aircraft carrier ever.
I'll be darned.
Yeah,
Wow.
it was fascinating. So I got to feel what it was like to be a sailor for the
Yes,
night.
you sure did. You keep thinking that, Mike.
I did. Oh yeah, I know exactly. So okay, so you're out of the Navy, and then you went to
I went to Pacific Southwest Airlines at the time.
the one with the smiley face, right?
The one with a smiley face,
Yep.
that's right. Then we merged with U.S. Airways,
Okay.
then we merged with America West, and then we merged with American Airlines.
And through this whole time, you were a pilot, or
I was a pilot, but after about 10 years, I got into the training department.
Okay.
So in the training department, I started out as what we call a check airman. And that's what you're doing is you're training pilots, you're evaluating pilots, and you're training them in the simulator, you're training them in the airplane, you're doing all those types of things. And then from there, I got into the management ranks where I was in charge of those programs. And before I was into the safety part, I was in charge of all the training of pilots at U.S. Airways. And so then it went into the safety. And the thing that I think is important in all of this is,
Yep.
and I'll give you a little philosophical thing as far as I'm concerned. And
Yeah.
and when I say safety, I'm really talking about risk management.
Right.
But the thing that I found was that if you're in this department, which is rather small, but it still is very influential, but you really don't do anything. What you do is you facilitate it and you help other people succeed. And the way you do that is that you are basically working with other departments and you're helping them identify risks, you're helping them determine how they're going to mitigate those risks, and you help them, you facilitate them doing their job. The other part of it is the tool that you have is training. One of the tools you have is training. And I don't own training and safety, but the training department does. And that training department is the one that gives the tools to the people in order to do their job and ensures that they're proficient with those tools. And if you can leverage the training department to be successful, you are now going to mitigate risk within your organization, and you're also going to you're going to operate much better.
This may sound like a silly question or comment, but we deal with risk managers all the time. And I would imagine part of what made you successful was the fact that you were a pilot. And actually, the reason why I say it's kind of silly is I couldn't imagine having somebody in in that role that did not have all of the experience that you had. But one of the challenges that we oftentimes see with risk management is there are folks that don't necessarily have the deep competency across the business. Was that, I mean, it's probably a no-brainer question, but I'm guessing that was probably critical to your success and credibility within the organization.
Well, on the pilot side of the house, but you have to remember, we're also dealing in the maintenance side of the house,
Sure.
airport customer service and all that. So you're absolutely correct. I didn't, in the beginning, have that credibility,
Yep.
but I sure learned fast. And I got involved, and so then I learned all about our maintenance side of the house. I learned all about customer service.
How would you do that? Would you, because that's one of the things that we try to get risk managers to do is almost get out of your silo, get out into the business, understand it, learn it, so that people will respect you and that you have credibility. What did you actually do to learn those businesses?
Well, I think there's multifaceted, and the first part that made it easier for me is I reported to the chief operating officer, and the senior VPs reported to the same person. So now we became a team. So
Right.
now I'm part of that team. I'm not isolated away in some way. So I think
Which is the case with many risk management groups. That oftentimes they don't report to that.
exactly, and
Yep.
I think that's really critical.
I do too.
Because now you're with those people, you're part of their team. Now you're creating that team working together. The second part of it is our chief operating officer at the time was Robert Isom. Now he's the president
Yep.
of the company. His whole mantra and his most important thing, and he didn't just say it, but he did it, was safety, regulatory compliance, risk management. So that became the culture of the company. So therefore, now you have credibility. So I know I haven't answered your question yet.
Yep.
But by being involved with those people and then dealing with the issues that come up, now you get involved with them and you start learning the business, and you have the people working for you. You have representatives from those parts of the business, and you just get involved.
I think you've hit on, though, maybe even a more important point than the question that I asked, which is where risk management should reside in an organization. And what I'm taking away is not only the reporting relationship to somebody who actually believed it and inculcated a culture, but you were integrated into the group. So it wasn't like a risk management bolt-on. It was integrated into all the activities, processes, decision-making, and so forth.
That's exactly right. And part of this safety management system I was talking to you about before that we work with the FAA in
Yep.
order to develop, and I call really a risk management system, that is embedded in every one of the departments. In every one of the operating departments, also in the security department. We have an environmental now. We've expanded it beyond the operating departments or anything the FAA has anything to do with. And so now what you have is you have parts of these departments that are working in the same business that you are. And within that, I have representatives from my department that facilitate and work with them. So I have, tentacles out there.
Out into the organization.
In the
yeah.
organization, but the organization takes responsibility for the risk management. I just facilitate them doing it, and I also ensure that it's standardized throughout the organization.
I was talking to a client about this exact same thing yesterday around kind of risk management's role in facilitating, but the business ultimately owns. Do you have any insights? Maybe that was just part of American and U.S. Air's culture, but any insights in how, this is going to sound silly. You have a risk management group. You have risk managers that go out into the business, do everything right, but then the business may not take it as seriously as the
Yep.
risk managers would want. What advice would you give to maybe an organization that doesn't have to be as focused on safety and risk management maybe as an airline does, but where risk management is so critical to their success, and they've got this challenge of risk management not playing that role as effectively as it could because the business kind of rejects it to a certain degree?
Well, it's interesting. I just had a conversation 2 days ago with another airline that's having the problem that you're talking about, because they have all these pieces, but they can't seem to get it to take traction. And with my discussions with them, really what it boiled down to is this. If you don't have the senior leadership
Right.
that is on board and says this is the priority, it's not going to happen. And so like I said before, when Robert Isom, our chief operating officer, now the president, that was the top priority. When we first merged with American Airlines, he went to the board, and part of his presentation on the board is this triangle.
Yep.
The base of the triangle is safety and regulatory compliance, then it's operational performance, then it is basically the customer experience. And he said, my goal for the first year of putting these two airlines together is safety and regulatory compliance. Without that, I can't have operational, integrity, and I cannot have the other. I have to have that foundation.
It's all built on that. Yep.
So it's all built on that. So now if you have the person that's in charge saying that and living that and doing it, then everybody that reports to him, the senior leadership, is going to have the same thing, and it works all its way down. If you don't have that, it's an uphill battle. You're hitting your head against a wall, and it's going to be very, very difficult. And I don't have the answer of how to solve that.
Well, I think you said one thing that I think is important is in many respects, it also starts with board risk oversight.
Yes.
And so the board should be asking the CEO these questions, and it can't be just lip service. Oh, yes, of course, risk management is important. Well, how are you actually demonstrating it day to day? How are you measuring it? How are you holding people accountable?
I couldn't agree with you more, Mike. That's exactly right.
Great. So let's actually, one of the areas in our pre-call that you touched on that I think is a trend now within risk management is using data to produce insights to get ahead of the risk. I know that's something that you're pretty passionate about. And the question that I have is how did you guys do that within American Airlines? And I want to drill down into like how data was collected, how it was used, how the insights, but maybe if you could just touch on the importance of data to begin to predict potential risk issues and how you did that within
Sure.
American.
So it's kind of interesting. Can I give you a little background first?
So a great thing about the podcast, we could go off and give us stories.
Sure,
Yes.
sure. So when I started my career, it was back in 1978 with PSA Airlines. I started on January 19th, 1978. On September 25th, so that's what, 8 months later?
Yep.
8 months later, there was Flight 182, PSA, that ran into a Cessna 172 on a downwind into Lindbergh Field. 137 people were on that airplane. It crashed into a neighborhood in San Diego.
I remember that.
Okay, and that was my first experience with a airliner accident. Of that 137 people, 37 of them were PSA employees. So it was an absolute disaster, regardless of 137 lives. And over the years, in the 80s and the 90s, basically we as an industry were flying 6 million flights a year. And if you do the statistics and say, okay, in the 2000s, we're going to be flying double that, 12,000.
Right.
You're going to have a fatal accident every quarter. Every quarter. So now you go forward to today, where we will have gone as an industry, the American, the American
Within
industry, within
yep.
the United States, the industry in the United States will have gone 8 years without a fatal accident, carrying 5 billion people. That's 2/3 of the world's population without one fatality. So the question, which is your question, Mike, is where I'm going back to, is
Yep.
something changed, right?
Drastically.
Drastically.
Yep.
So over those years, what changed in order to get us there? And there are a lot of different things that changed. But one of the things that changed is now being basically what we were doing is reacting to every accident. In other words, reacting to every crisis, saying what went wrong, what do we have to fix? And from doing that with all those accidents, we created a lot of, technology, like we're talking about that fly-by-wire system in the Airbus.
Yep.
We have technology to keep airplanes from hitting the ground, all kinds of technology, but we also learned some other things. And the other things were we needed to collect data in order to determine what was going on out there so we could go from being reactive to proactive. So where do we get this data from? We get data from reports from pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, things that we didn't have before because they just experienced it.
They just didn't collect it?
They
or
didn't collect
it. Okay.
And we have a system, though, where they can share things that before they may have gotten in trouble for, because they made a mistake.
Right.
Not intentional, but they made a mistake, but now they can report that. And so now we have all this data on what's going on out there. We have data from the airplanes themselves. So we collect data on the airplane that has all kinds of parameters that we look at.
I would imagine with technology, too, with like the Internet of Things. I was talking to the general counsel of GE, and he was talking about how technology enabled the jets are nowadays that maybe they didn't have 10 or 15 years ago.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we collect data there.
Yep.
We collect data from the airplane itself.
Right.
So now we take all this data and we start looking at, instead of accidents, we start looking at precursors. Things that are, if this and this and this happen, it could be an accident. So now we start looking at precursors. Now we can start addressing risks that we didn't know that were there before.
Do you have an example, like to make it real, like potentially some sort of a risk that was identified through the accumulation of all this data that you were able to do something differently as a result?
Sure. I can give you a couple. One of them is flying into like Burbank Airport.
Yep.
And when you go into Burbank Airport, little Van Nuys Airport, you fly over.
Right.
Well, we were getting what they call alerts that we were getting close to small airplanes. So what they did is they said, hey, we get all these different alerts. What can we do to change the airspace in order for that not to have those conflicts? So there's one example. Another example is one of the things we look at is what we call unstable approaches. So a pilot might be a little bit fast, a little bit high coming in, and he may be able to handle it, or it might be a little touchy when he gets on the ground. So what we were able to do is see how many of these were going on and why, and then we put into place different policies, different procedures in order to help the pilots be stable basically almost 100% of the time.
What would be just, I'm curious, I'm probably getting geeky with the aviation, but what would contribute to them come in and high? Like, I'm trying to understand what they would have done before that they could now do differently as a result of the insights.
Part of it, believe it or not, is in an interface with air traffic control. So air traffic control might be asking him to keep his speed up. Air traffic control might turn him in when he's way too high, and the pilot accepts it. So therefore, we look at what did the pilot do, what did air traffic control do, and then we can talk to the air traffic controllers and say, hey guys, you don't understand what you caused this to happen, and change their policies and change their procedures. And we've done that in a lot of different places.
Well, I think that's interesting because a lot of times a crisis or an event that is a manifestation of a risk is oftentimes a multitude of things that are coming together. So your example of, the aircraft controller telling them to cut in when they're high is interesting because it's not just based on decisions they're making, it's also based on decisions or recommendations from other groups.
Sure.
Yep.
So there's another part of this, and that is I was talking about what an airline does, right? Because we collect this data, but we as an industry with the FAA have an organization called CAS, Commercial Aviation Safety Team, and a SIAS, Aviation Safety Information Analysis and Sharing. And what we have 43, I think it's 48 airlines now that are taking the data I was talking about and pooling it together. Pulling it all together, and we also take data from the air traffic control system from, I think it's like 30 some odd sources, and so then what we can do is we can look at, instead of just one airline that only sees one small piece of the pie, we can look at everybody, what's going on, and we can identify things that somebody wouldn't want to identify.
How did that come about? Because
that came about back in 1998. If you remember, all these accidents were happening in the 90s. There was a Gore Commission. And they went out there, and there was also another congressional study, and they said something needs to be done in order to ensure that we don't have these. So out of that Gore Commission and the other commission, they said, okay, you guys need to, in 10 years, decrease the fatal accident rate by 80%. And so that's how CAS was born. And so CAS is made up of the industry, the airlines, it's made up of the manufacturers, the FAA, we have NTSB is on it, NASA's on it, all kinds of different people are on it. And we basically have worked over those 10 years. Instead, so that's from 98 to 2008, we got 83% decrease. So from 2010 to 2025, we want to do another 50% on top of that.
And it sounds like it's not just a U.S. If you have 83 airlines, I'm guessing international carriers are in there as well.
It's only U.S. carriers.
Oh, it's only U.S. carriers.
It's only U.S. carriers, but what has happened is it's spread into other places. So the European Union area out there, they've created a similar one. They're creating another one out in the Pacific region type of area. They're all looking to do the same thing. And also what CAS does is it reaches out. It reaches out to all the different areas, and it shares what we've learned, but it also helps them develop the same type of process in order to try to minimize risk.
What I love, and I think maybe a learning maybe that to other industries, is you had many organizations coming together where safety, I would argue, is not really a competitive advantage. It's just expected, right?
That's correct.
And by having organizations come together to produce a safer product for their customers is something I think a lot of other industries, quite frankly. I mean, obviously the impetus was, I guess, the Gore Commission that pushed that. But I would argue other industries could come together for high-risk areas and pull data together, because that's something that doesn't happen as much maybe as it should.
And that's true, and we've actually had requests. We've talked to the automobile industry, oil and pipeline industry, medical. We've talked to those guys. So they are looking, a lot of them are looking at that. They have, it's not as easy for them to do it as it is for us. We have one regulatory oversight board. We have Congress that supports what we're doing. So they have bigger obstacles, but they're still working towards that.
Yep. Anything else? Because this whole notion, I think we're going through this renaissance period where risk management is changing so that it's less reactive. I think a lot of organizations are struggling with how do you become more proactive. Any other insights that maybe you can share to help organizations even just get their mind around how to begin to identify potential threats and mitigate them before they actually become an issue? Anything else that you guys
Well, I
may have
think
done?
most companies have business continuity.
Yep.
And so business continuity, in a sense, is looking at that, right?
Right.
From one perspective. The other perspective is just having the foresight to be looking at the things, not living day to day of what we're doing today, but what we're looking at tomorrow. And then when we're planning for tomorrow, what are the risks that we might encounter, and then staying on top of that, because as you well know, everything's changing so rapidly, especially
Fast,
now.
right.
Yes, exactly.
Well, one of the things that I think is emerging, one of the things that we've talked to a lot of clients, and there's a handful out there, but is this convergence of understanding what those future risks may be, and then using data. I mean, one thing that we have that's ubiquitous is data, and there's some incredible technology tools out there to start to draw insights from that data so that they could then start to make better decisions. And we've seen it everywhere from, what are consumer preferences of the future, which obviously is not, it's a risk, it's a business risk, it's a strategic risk
Exactly.
more than a safety issue.
Right.
But that is absolutely a trend that we're beginning to see.
Yeah.
So let's pivot to crisis, and I think you've talked a bit about this, but I'm curious, maybe diving more deeply into an accident happens. Can you maybe describe from your, the seat that you sat in, what would happen after that? And really what I'm curious about is not only your role, but how the executive team would come together, because one of the things that we've seen within Deloitte, and once again, this is not necessarily from a safety perspective only, but a lot of organizations, and cyber is kind of the popular thing right now, is that an incident happens and that many, I would say, senior executives and CEOs have not been through a crisis that is all over the social media, all over the news, and their ability to react because they've just never gone through it before. Maybe they haven't been trained. That was a big theme that we talked a bit about.
Sure.
But I'd love to learn about, because I think the airlines do this really well. Can you maybe touch on how an airline responds to a crisis like that, and maybe what's done to prepare the CEO's executive team and others to make sure that you respond appropriately?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And rather than tell you what we do first, I'm going to tell you what we plan. Okay.
That's
And what we plan, we have emergency planning and response. So I was in charge of that department. And so basically what we're doing is we are planning how we are going to respond to an accident, everything that goes to it. And so when an accident comes down, what the first thing that's going to happen is notification. Notification is going to go out to everybody. Then we're going to set up our command center. The command center gets set up, and then we have sub-command centers that report into the command center. And everybody has a checklist. Everybody has a role. Everybody knows exactly what they need to do.
Yep.
And at the same time, we're putting together a GO team. The GO team is going to go to the site of the accident and start working with the NTSB. And I mean, it goes on and on and on and on and on. So this is a very comprehensive document.
how clear are role? I'm guessing the roles and responsibilities are clear. How well does everybody understand their role and responsibility?
That's very interesting. So let me put it this way. When I did the merger with America West,
Yep.
and so we're now putting two airlines together, we had to create basically a new emergency planning and response. And so what we did is we put it all together. We worked with all the different departments, all the different parts of it. But then the big key is this. What we're going to do, and we did, and we continue to do, is we do a drill every single quarter. 4 times a year we do a drill.
And who participates in that?
Everybody from the CEO to the president to everybody that has something on that checklist. It's as though an accident happened. CorpCom is involved in that. And so when you go through this, you have, I'll give you an example with you're talking about the media part and all that type of
Yep.
stuff. We have pre-scripted all the media type of things for an accident that we were going to say, but that's just a start, right?
Right.
They're going to get changed depending upon what the situation is. And after a certain amount of time, there's going to be a certain thing that comes out from CorpCom. And after a certain amount of time, the CEO is going to go downstairs into the lobby where the press is, and he's going to make a statement. So we actually have him go down the lobby, and we simulate all of that. So they are always involved. The CEO, the president, the senior VPs, the executive VPs, everybody's involved in this. It's all hands on deck. So where I'm going with that is we are prepared. When it happens, we are prepared. Now, we're not, we're going to have to modify it as the circumstances change. But the next part of this, I think, is extremely important. I talked about that as relative to an airplane accident.
Right.
What we learned early on was it applies to all kinds of
Everything,
things.
yep.
It applies to everything. So
Yeah.
we have used that as the template. In other words, we use that tool if we have an incident, if we have something with cyber like you're talking about, something else like that.
An outage. I mean, we've had several airlines
Exactly.
that have had outages recently.
So
Yep.
our operations control center, it's an integrated operations control center. They're the ones that kick it off. They will kick it off. We'll get everybody in the line. Then we'll start figuring out what players do we need, what players do we don't need, and then we can manage it from there. So everybody is trained on doing it. So we do 4 of those a year, like I said. We have 10 of our regional partners. We do 1 of these drills with each regional partner. So over the year, we will do 14 drills.
What precipitated making it more than just a safety or, a potential accident? Was it just a realization that, wow, it's not the only type of crisis that American or U.S. Air could potentially have, and let's expand it?
Yeah, I mean, you just looked at it and it just made logical sense.
Right. What I don't understand, and I don't know if you have an opinion on this, but what we have a hard time wrapping our minds around is there are seemingly crises that are happening to, some of the most iconic brands almost I shouldn't say every day, but once a week maybe?
Yeah.
I mean, you just open up the paper. And what seems to happen is they're not prepared. And one of the things that we know, we did some research on this, we found that we call it a novel crisis, something you're not prepared for. It just hits you, from the side, that it's likely going to happen once every 5 years to a public, large Fortune 500 company. Mm-hmm. That's not a long time. So like if you're CEO, it's likely going to happen during your duration. Well, one of the things that we find is that the extent, and maybe the preparation would be a little more for an airline, but even just being prepared is something that they get intellectually. Like, yeah, if a crisis happens, I want to be prepared because it's a career-defining event. If I handle it wrong, I'm going to be out. But it's never a priority. Do you have any advice or guidance to those CEOs or executives that are saying, yeah, I get that we're probably going to have a crisis, whether it's financial, operational, technological, whatever it may be. What advice do you have for them, or do you?
Well, like I said before, it all stems from coming from the top.
Right.
When we decided we're going to do this, and the CEO said, I will be involved in every one of those drills, now you have it. Because basically, if this is what you want to do, you make the time to do it, and you ensure that you have the resources to do it, and you do it.
Right. But let me just press on that a little. Totally get that it comes from the top.
Right.
What if the top is the one saying, that's not the number one thing on my plate?
Well, then I would say that the next level down, whoever determines that it should be there needs somehow to influence it and to ensure that it gets done.
One of the things that may be helpful, I think sometimes people get religion when they actually go through those simulations too, because my guess is even though you guys do it 4 times a year, 14 when you extrapolate it to all of your partners, that's a lot, right? My guess is, and maybe you could touch on this, is after every one of those simulations, you probably learn a lot. Can you maybe talk about that?
Absolutely. What we have, you're absolutely correct. What we have are action items. After every single one, you think after as many as that we did, we'd have it down pat, but we changed the scenarios. We changed the whole thing. We have things for active shooters. We had things for aircraft accidents. We have all kinds of stuff. And after every single one, we go through and we determine what action items are, what didn't go so well, what did go well, and we are improving it every time.
So I think maybe the key to anybody that's listening out there is the simulations are not necessarily just they are to practice. That's probably one of the key things, but it's also actually to test the resiliency of your plan to begin with, because you're always going to find things that you can improve.
That's
I'm
exactly
guessing
right.
You agree with that?
Yep.
How about bankruptcy? I think you mentioned, obviously American, I think, went through a bankruptcy. You've been through a couple. I'm guessing everything we just talked to a certain degree applies even in a bankruptcy, but any perspective on?
Well, now you're talking a little other side of the equation. We talked about, with accidents, what do? We determine what went wrong and what we're going to fix, right? Well, bankruptcy is, in a sense, somewhat the same, but even more so in the sense that in a bankruptcy, something went wrong and you need to fix it, right?
Right.
And it gives you the tools in order to fix it. But at the same time, there are other things that you have opportunities to do things that you wouldn't have had otherwise. Could be it labor contracts, be it whatever, that you need to take a look at where you are, where you need to be, and you have this fleeting opportunity. You need to take advantage. And when I say advantage, it's use it what word do I want to use? It's not really advantage, because that sounds like you're taking advantage of somebody. What you want to optimize.
Yeah.
Optimize your opportunity.
You, I think this was a quote, and if I got you wrong, you can correct me, but I'd love for you to reflect on it. You said, don't spend time to find fault, but funnel that energy to learn and make real changes. You've kind of touched on that, but maybe can you reflect on that for a second?
Oh, yeah.
Did I get it right first
Oh,
of
you
all?
got it perfect.
Okay, good.
Yeah, absolutely perfect. Because a lot of times what people will do is try to figure out, who did this or who did that or what the fault was. And basically what you really want to do is say, okay, here's where we are today. What do we need to do going forward to make it a better organization and a better business and a better everything, and not try to determine who did what or when. But you also need to figure out what failed in order to fix it. That's true.
I would imagine, especially in your business, having that, or creating that culture and mindset also probably makes whoever may have been in the midst of it, whatever type of crisis, much more willing to participate in the solution as well, which I would think through the process it would help a lot more. Because if I feel like I'm being vilified for something I did versus, hey, listen, this is all just about making sure we do it better in the future,
Yep.
my willingness to participate and help is going to be vastly different. I don't know if you've seen that.
Oh, I have, absolutely. What I used to tell my people is, we're all going to make mistakes. It's how well you recover.
Awesome. So let's pivot, and you've talked about the importance of kind of training and culture, but I want to drill down into that because I think that's something that you guys really are a model. American was a model for. So can you talk about, maybe you talked about in this context of the Soli example, but can you maybe, for folks that aren't in aviation, talk about training, not only with pilots, but all of the other groups that are integral to delivering not only a great product, but a safe product. Can you maybe touch on training?
Sure. Especially, I think, in all industries, training is critical because what you want to do is you want to ensure that the people have the knowledge, they have the tools, and that they know how to use those tools effectively. But also through training, you can also change cultures, and you can get the culture that you want within your company. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes focus, but training is essential. That's the only way you're going to succeed.
How do you make training stick, though? And let me give you an example. I've gone to a million trainings, and I was actually in a training yesterday, and one of our partners who was leading it asked everybody to put their phones away. And I know that sounds so simple, but if you're, there's research on, when you're multitasking, you can't be in the moment and learn. So it's interesting to me because some training is really effective when you're fully engaged and obviously not effective. How do you make it real and matter within Americans so people actually take it seriously?
Well, I think first is exactly what you said.
Put your damn phone away.
Put your damn phone away.
Yeah.
But I think the other part, and the training side, if you can get people to understand why they're doing something, what the reasoning is behind it, if you just tell them you have to do A, B, and C,
Right.
they're going to forget that.
Right.
And they're not going to do it. But if you tell them why it's meaningful, why it matters, why it cares, and they have an understanding of that and what they're trying to accomplish, now you're going to be effective. The other thing that I found, too, is what we have a tendency to do is train. Okay, you've been trained. Done.
Right.
What you have to do is you have to reinforce that training. And one of the things that we did with our pilots is we have the training that's done in the classroom. We have distance learning type of stuff, computer-based training. And so in the computer-based training, they do this every quarter. So if you want somebody to really learn something, become a part of them, what you're going to do is throughout that quarter system, after 6 times when you've approached the same subject from a different perspective each time, it becomes a part of them. And so that reinforcement is important. And when you reinforce it, you do it from a different angle every time.
It's I'm just reflecting on training that I've been through. Is one of the things I see at organizations is they'll train you on X, and then you'll never go back to that topic again because you'll move to Y.
Yep.
And then you'll move to Z. But you're never reinforcing, I guess, to your point, what you learned in the X training because you just keep moving on to like the next new thing. And one of the things I hear you saying is in order for training to really be effective, and it could be in any part of the business, it's not just about that first training endeavor. It's actually about practicing, rehearsing, going back to it, practicing, rehearsing, going back to it. And that's where it makes it more effective. Is that your experience?
That's my experience. And the other thing that's extremely important, too, is basically where you're measuring how effective you are.
I was going to ask, so how do you guys measure, I'd say the ROI, I sound like a consultant, but how would you measure the impact of training?
A lot of that has to do with, remember we were talking about that data?
Yep.
It's looking at the data It's looking at the reports that you get. It's looking at the stuff that you get off of the airplane. It's looking at another one could be basically be, you have aircraft damages. Aircraft damages usually are caused by somebody not following policy and procedures. So now you take a look at that, and that's your indicator of how well are we doing as far as getting that across to our workforce.
Any perspectives on because one of the big conversations nowadays is, or not even conversations, it's the reality we live in. There's virtual training, and then there's live training. Any perspectives on that?
I think they both have their place, and I think on the live training part, I think on both training, but mostly on the live training, there are people that are absolutely superb trainers, and they know how to get the point across. They know how to get people engaged. They know how to get them to understand, and it's a talent, and those are the people that are invaluable. And then there are other people that are basically going through, they do okay, but they're not as good as that. You'll always have that one teacher you remember from school that would just really motivate you.
My calculus, yeah.
Calculus, whoa.
Well, no. So my story is, just to go off on a tangent, I was not doing well in my first calculus class when I was in university, and I was able to get out of it, so it was like I never took it. Who knows what I would have gotten, but I don't think my parents would have been proud. I got an A+ the second time, and the only reason was the guy, I don't even know if he knew the topic as well as my first teacher, but he was able to convey it in a way that it was sticky. And I think, Paul, I think you bring up probably one of the most important points I've ever heard about training is you can have, it's almost like the Michael Jordan of training, but does that mean he's the best coach?
Right.
No, not necessarily.
Yep.
And sometimes having somebody that may not be as technically sound as the next person, but could convey the most important topics in a way so that people walk out of that room and remember it, I think is critical.
I do too. And then when you take that into your virtual learning and you take it into your computer-based learning, it's again the quality. Of the product.
Yep. So let's talk about culture. And I think culture is one of those, it's like it when you see it, like a good culture. And I love, actually, I've got some unbelievable clients that I've worked with where I'm like, I would like to work here, and I almost know within 30 seconds, just based on how people treat each other. It's not necessarily just having values up on a wall; they actually live them. But can you talk about how American or even U.S. Air before that would go about creating that culture of safety and some of the other things that you've talked about?
Again, as far as culture is concerned, I'm a firm believer that it starts at the top. And it has to start at the top. And the hardest part in culture is to get that from the top and getting all the way down the different levels. All you need is one break in that chain, and it can, for that area, it can kind of go downhill. So the big challenge we have is we have the culture at the top, we have the culture at the, the executive level, we have it further down. It's when you start getting to the supervisor and manager level where sometimes it does break down, and that's our biggest challenge. So we work very hard on ensuring that we train to it, that we exhibit it, that it's made a high priority throughout the organization, but we still will, first off, you always have a lot of work to do.
Yep.
If you ever think you're there, you got a problem.
One of the things I've seen is sometimes it's about accountability too.
Yes.
Because you could have, I'll go back to that, technically proficient person that does the job better than anybody, but if they're cancerous to the culture of the organization, sometimes organizations let it slide because, hey, that person does IT better than anybody I've ever seen. We got to keep them. But we all know that cancer creates potentially more problems. And I think it's holding people accountable to something that, sometimes it's kind of squishy, culture, right? So I think accountability is probably important.
I think accountability is extremely important. I couldn't agree with you more.
So let's talk about the future of safety. I'm just curious, where do you see, if you had your crystal ball, where do you think safety is going, let's say, in the next 10 or 15 years, or whatever time frame you want to use? Is there any big things that are on the horizon that you see?
I don't see big things on the horizon. What I see is an expansion of the risk management that we're talking about, the data analysis, and the proactive work that we're doing. And in the aviation industry, before, as I said before we were looking at accidents, fatal accidents, and determining what needed to be fixed. Then we were looking at the things that were close calls, and that. Now what we're looking at are the one-offs. You're talking about something that happens 1 in 100 million times. And you say, well, why would we look at a one-off? Because those one-offs are the things now that we have to try to prevent happening. But the other part of it that, and you had touched on this, Mike, and I'm making something that's basically this analogous.
Yep.
And that is when you get to the top of your game. So we're at the top of our game. We've gone 8 years without an accident, right? So most people would say, we got it solved. We got it fixed. Well, I equate
That's
this...
right when an accident will happen, right?
Well, it will, but so what I equate this to is you take a superstar athlete, right? In order for him to stay at the top, what does he do? He works even harder. In order for him to get any better, he has to work harder and harder. So we're at that same point. We're at the same point where instead of saying, you know what, we can relax a little bit, anytime you get success, that means you have to work extremely harder in order to ensure that the success stays, and you have to be wary of what's going on around you, and you have to look at what change is happening, and you have to stay on top of it.
Okay, so let's, I'm going to ask some, this is always my favorite part of the podcast. One of the things when I started this, it was all just about kind of clinically going through the questions we've gone through, but one of the things I've learned, and it happened organically, was leadership insights. And you've been in aviation for many, many years, and I'd love to just touch on some perspectives that you have that you could share with other leaders. And then, quite frankly, we get a lot of kids that are coming out of college, and I think sometimes these are the best nuggets for them as they think about embarking on their career. So one of the things that you had mentioned previously is that it's all about passion. And I think that's one of the things I actually when I talk to my kids about what they're going to do in their future, I think sometimes we guide them. Even going back to my aviation story, like I got misdirected for whatever reason, and I think it's important to follow your passion. But I'd love to get your perspective on that, because I know that that's something that's important to you.
Oh, it is important to me, and I've just been fortunate because every job that I've had, for whatever reason, I've had a passion for what I was doing. By having that passion, you're engaged, and it's contagious.
How were you able to get jobs that you were passionate about? Because you've had kind of a varied career at the different airlines that you've worked in. If you're giving counsel to somebody that's been in an organization 10 years, doesn't matter what type it is, what would you tell them? How were you able to always pursue that passion? Or did it happen serendipitously?
Well, it almost happened serendipitously, really, because every one of the jobs that I changed into, somebody had asked me to do that job.
Okay.
So what I would take from that is if you passionately do the job that you're in,
right,
and you do it extremely well, opportunity will find you. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be looking for it, but opportunity will find you.
You just hit on something, but I would argue that you probably made a decision early on to do something that you loved. And so just being in aviation, you put yourself in the right place to have the opportunity. But you just hit on something I think is really important. And we a lot of times will get younger kids or even older folks that come in and they're always looking to their next job. And one of the things I always counsel them is, first of all, if you love your job, that's fantastic. And if you're passionate about it, but if you do the job better than anybody else, you don't need to politic for your next job. People will find you and opportunity will come.
I could not agree with you more.
Let's talk about another thing I think you've talked a lot about, and it's not about you, it's about people and their success. And my question for you is, has this been always a belief that you've had, or did that evolve during your career? Because I think it's obvious, like if you can empower people and they're happy, they're going to do more for you. But that's not a management technique that's used by many. A lot of times, maybe it's ego or whatever gets in the way. People focus on themselves and not necessarily others. So I'm just curious if you can maybe kind of dive into that one a little. I'd love to see if your perspective has evolved over time.
Well, it's kind of interesting. When you think, and I think I know where it came from. And when you start in training, if you think when you're a trainer,
right.
So I'm an evaluator trainer, I am helping somebody else succeed. So I'm taking a guy that's never flown this airplane, and I'm now putting him in the simulator, and I'm training him, and I'm helping him succeed. So all you do is take that and say, I'm going to do that in my management role. And I think that's where it came from. It was born from that, helping other people succeed. My guess is,
this is at least my personal experience, is that when I see somebody succeed, or when I can make an impact, and this may sound kind of cheeky, but it actually makes me feel better as a person, like I'm happier, I'm more fulfilled. Is that kind of the feeling?
Absolutely. Absolutely. What I've always told everybody working for me is my job is to help them succeed, and I expect them to, for the people working for them, to help them succeed. And I always tell them, if you succeed and you find another job, don't worry about me. Don't worry about that I'm going to have to fill your spot that you've done so well. That's my problem, and I'm proud and I'm glad to have that problem. I want you to succeed.
Well, I think when you, the responsibility you had, my guess is you inculcated a culture that people actually wanted to work with you then. Yeah. So it's actually it's funny because people that get uptight about people leaving their business or organization, usually are the ones that probably haven't created that culture where other people want to come. If you created that culture and everybody's wanting to come, life's actually pretty good because you're always drawing the best talent.
Exactly. And the other thing, too, that you have to do is you have to ensure that you have succession planning. And the most important thing you can ever do is you should never say, I can't take vacation because the place is going to fall apart if I'm gone. You need to have a team behind you that can run if you're not there for a while, and also that if you were to leave, you have somebody that's going to come into your place and take over and do as good, if not better job than you're doing.
Let me talk about another thing you said. You said that leaders should embrace change, not for change's sake, but to advance and in many cases keep up. And the question I have for you is, being in a safety and risk world, you encounter change on a continual basis. And my question is, what advice would you give for kind of responding to and being adept to move with change?
Well, be flexible and be open. That's the big key. So many people get set in their ways, and this is the way we've always done it, and this is the way we're always going to do it. And to me, the whole thing is saying, is there a better way to do it? But when you're saying it's a better way, make sure it's a better way. So there's change for change's sake, and there's change for improvement. And so you really need to determine which way you're going, but be open to it. And
would you think about, actually, you just made me think of something, because there's different behavioral archetypes, people that may be more resistant to change, that are really good at doing things the way they've always been, which there is some value to that.
Yes.
But then there's also people that are wired like myself. I look at something and it's like, even if it's perfect, okay, let's change it because there's always a better way. Would you actually think about the people you hired? Would you ever like step back and say, do I have the right mix of people that bring different strengths to my team?
oh, sure, absolutely. Yeah, you know, that's what you do need. You need that mix in order to have stability, like you were talking about, Mike, but then also to have the innovative part, looking at how things are and evaluating if it can be done better.
Yep. So I actually found my quote that I botched earlier in the interview, which was, "Chance favors the prepared mind," and it seems like being prepared. I mean, we've talked about just almost it's part of your DNA. You talked about the training, and I think one of the things, and you just said this a few minutes ago, it's everything is changing so fast. We borrowed the term VUCA, which I'm sure you're, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. That's like the world we live in. What advice would you give to CEOs and others about being prepared for all this change? And let me just maybe 10 seconds. One of the things that we find, and you see with a lot of organizations, is they know change is coming, and that change is going to disrupt their business. But they got a cash cow, right? And they're not going to do anything to kill it right now. But they know that if they don't do anything about it, they potentially are going to be facetiously like the next Blockbuster or whatever. What guidance do you have for folks or leaders in that?
Well, I guess the guidance I would give is, number one, listen. You need to listen and look, and then you need to basically have a strategy of, okay, we have the business going where it is now. I know there's going to be change. Now be planning for how can we adapt to that change. So,
would you ever get, in the context of anything that you did, would you ever seek out people that had very different perspectives from you, or maybe didn't agree with the way you thought, to try to find inspiration for maybe thinking differently?
I would suspect, well, I've run into people like that.
Yep.
I don't think I've gone out to seek those type of people in what I was doing.
Okay. When you think of the word resilient, what comes to mind? What are the attributes of a resilient leader, would you say?
I would say resilient, when things start getting bad or things are going the wrong way, is basically what you do is, number one is you have a positive attitude. Yep. And number two is you work even harder to try to figure out where the light is at the end of the tunnel and what do you need to do in order to get there. And so, to me, it's just another challenge is what it is, and taking on challenge.
I think it also, the one thing that I've definitely taken away is when you were talking about in a time of an accident or a crisis, don't focus on placing blame, focus on improving. So it's almost, in some respects, I would argue, just your mindset. You almost have a resilient mindset, I would argue.
Well, I would agree with that, yeah.
Anybody jumps to the top of your mind that you would say, that's a resilient person?
Well, probably nobody that would know on the podcast, but a lot of the people that I've worked with at American Airlines, for sure.
That's awesome. Well, Paul, this has been incredible. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mike. I've enjoyed it.
What an incredible conversation. And thank you to everybody that is listening to Resilient. You know, we track our numbers, and it's been going up significantly over the last few months. And so thank you very much. We love this podcast. We have a great production group, Rivet Radio. They've been with us on this journey since day one. This is becoming one of my favorite parts of my job, I have to say. And if you're interested in listening, if you stumbled across this somehow, you could go to Deloitte.com, but you can also go to all these podcatchers. What makes the podcast medium so awesome, in my opinion, is you could take it on the run. You could do it when you're working out. You could do it while you're walking your dog. You could do it when you're flying. So go to your favorite podcatcher. I go to iTunes. All you got to do is put Resilient into the keyword search. And I'd encourage you, check out our previous episodes. We have some great conversations with people like Keith Wandell from Harley Davidson or Jackie Rice from Target, some incredible conversations. So go check them out. And I'll tell you, if you're enjoying these conversations, share them with your work colleagues, share them with your family, share them with your friends. You know, I got a message from my father-in-law last week, and he's like, you know what? These are actually pretty good, Mike. I listened to one and I was captivated. He listened to the Mallory one and said, I'm actually going to start listening. So listen, if my father-in-law likes it, you know, he's a retired guy, I'm guessing your friends and colleagues and family will like it as well. And if you have a minute, if you could give me a gift, I would be so appreciative if you could just go out and just rate the podcast. I can't tell you how much it helps in getting the word out about Resilient. And also, hit me up on LinkedIn or Twitter. I have been blown away by how much social media engagement that I've gotten. If you have any recommendations for the future guests or any comments, just let me know. My name is Michael Kearney, I think as everybody know. My last name spelled Kearney. And, you know, I have a lot of new friends out there, so keep it coming. It has been fantastic.